The girl had always been known for her quietness, a kind of stillness that unsettled some and drew the mockery of others. While other children laughed loudly, wrestled in the dust, or sang with abandon, she preferred to sit in corners, watching the dance of shadows across the walls, or trace patterns in the dirt with her fingertips. Her silence was not born of weakness but of thoughtfulness, yet in the harshness of her village, where conformity was strength and difference was dangerous, her ways were deemed strange. Whispers followed her wherever she walked, whispers that grew sharper as she grew older. Her stepmother, a woman whose cruelty sharpened like a blade with each passing year, was the loudest voice among them. She painted the girl as cursed, saying her quiet nature drew bad omens, her distant stare unsettled the ancestors, and her stillness was an insult to the restless spirits who demanded constant energy and praise. It was not long before the murmurs of suspicion hardened into a decision that she should no longer sleep within the safety of a roof. The day of her banishment was not marked with ceremony or compassion, but with sharp words and cold eyes. She remembered the way the sun pressed down on her back as she gathered the little she owned, a torn piece of cloth, a small calabash for water, and the tiny carved figure her mother had given her before she died. Her stepmother had pressed her hand hard on the girl's shoulder and shoved her toward the edge of the village, her voice loud enough for all to hear. "Let her sleep under the fig tree if she will not live like the rest of us. Let the spirits take her silence as their own." The villagers watched, some with pity, others with relief, for they had long feared the stepmother's tongue. No one dared speak for the girl. She walked away without tears, though her chest ached with the weight of abandonment. She had learned early that her pain was never welcomed, that her tears would only feed her stepmother's joy. And so, she carried herself with dignity, each step steady as though the earth itself might judge her courage. The old fig tree stood just beyond the village boundary, its roots thick and gnarled, its branches reaching outward like dark arms holding secrets. It had stood there longer than anyone could remember, a silent witness to births, harvests, betrayals, and burials. The elders spoke of it with mixed tones. Some said it was sacred, blessed by ancestral spirits who once rested beneath its shade. Others warned that it was cursed, a tree that fed on suffering, a place where exiles went and never truly returned. To the girl, it became both prison and shelter. That first night, she sat beneath its broad trunk, feeling the rough bark press against her back, the earth cool beneath her legs. The wind moved through its leaves with a sound like whispers, and though fear pressed heavy in her chest, she felt a strange comfort, as if the tree had been waiting for her. Her innocence clung to her like a fragile garment even in the face of cruelty. She did not curse her family, nor did she shout at the injustice done to her. She simply survived. Each morning she rose from the tangled shadows of the fig tree and walked to the stream for water. Each evening she returned to her place beneath the roots, her body adjusting to the hardness of the earth, her spirit learning to endure the loneliness. Sometimes children from the village would sneak near, tossing stones at her or laughing from a distance, daring each other to approach the tree. "She is the cursed one," they whispered. "The fig has claimed her." But she did not shout at them nor chase them away. She only lowered her eyes, her silence a shield against the cruelty of those who had never felt the sting of being unwanted. And yet, despite her exile, there was a quiet strength about her. The roots of the fig tree seemed to respond to her presence. At night, when she lay down to sleep, she felt them shifting slightly beneath her body, as though they were adjusting to cradle her form. Sometimes she woke to find fallen figs resting near her hands, as though the branches had bent low to feed her. The villagers began to notice that she did not grow weaker with her banishment. Instead, her face grew calmer, her body lean but strong, her eyes holding a glow that unsettled even those who despised her. They said the tree was feeding her, that the spirits beneath its roots were whispering to her. Fear mingled with curiosity, but still no one dared approach her closely. The girl herself thought often of her mother, wondering if she watched from beyond the veil of the living. She whispered her thoughts into the bark of the tree, telling it of her longing for kindness, her hunger for belonging, and the ache of sleeping alone in the dark. The tree never answered in words, but its shade wrapped around her when the sun burned, and its roots cushioned her when the nights grew cold. Slowly she began to see the tree as both companion and protector, a silent guardian against the cruelty of the world. Though she had been banished with nothing, she had found something that no one could take from her, a place where her silence was not mocked, where her stillness was not feared, where her very presence seemed to matter. And so the banished girl became the girl of the fig tree, a figure both pitied and whispered about, her innocence preserved even in exile. She did not yet know that the same roots that comforted her would one day reveal their own hunger, their own power, and that her story of endurance would grow into a legend that the village could never forget. The old fig tree stood like a giant at the edge of the village, its trunk wider than 3 men could circle with outstretched arms, its branches twisting upward and outward like a web of ancient veins. Its leaves were dark and heavy, rustling with a sound that seemed older than wind itself. Children were warned not to linger beneath its shade, yet they always did, drawn by its looming presence, daring each other to touch its bark or peer into the hollow spaces between its roots. The tree was not merely a part of the land, it was a presence, something that belonged to both the living and the dead. For generations, it had been there, unchanging, eternal, while huts crumbled, while harvests came and went, while families rose and vanished into the soil. It was the tree that outlived them all, its shadow stretching like a memory across every age of the village. The elders spoke of the fig tree in stories that shifted depending on the teller. Some called it sacred, saying that it had been planted in the days when the ancestors first settled on the land, a marker of their bond with the spirits. They told of rituals performed beneath its canopy, where offerings of millet, palm oil, or animal blood were poured at its roots, feeding not just the soil but the unseen one said to dwell beneath. The ground around the tree was always slightly damp, even in the fiercest heat of the dry season, as though something living and thirsty drank constantly from deep below. "It is blessed," the old one said. "The ancestors live in its roots, guarding us, watching us, reminding us." For these elders, the tree was a place of reverence. They touched its bark with respect, bowed their heads when they passed, and instructed the young to treat it as one would a shrine. But there were other voices steeped in fear. They claimed the tree was cursed, that it had not been planted by hands of faith but had sprouted from the grave of someone wronged, someone whose restless soul refused to fade. They pointed to the strange way the branches curved downward at night, casting shadows that moved even when the wind was still. They whispered of sounds that could be heard if one pressed their ear to the bark, the low groan of voices buried alive in the roots. Some swore that they had seen figures beneath its branches at night, pale outlines of people who should have been long dead, their faces twisted in silence, their eyes staring. Children who strayed too close sometimes came back trembling, saying they felt fingers brushing their ankles or voices whispering their names. A few unlucky ones returned with scratches on their legs, as if the roots had tried to hold them. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between reverence and fear, but no one could deny that the fig tree was powerful. The villagers relied on it in ways they rarely admitted aloud. Its figs fed birds and monkeys, but also children who dared to snatch the fallen fruit. Its shade gave shelter to weary travelers who arrived unknowing of its reputation. And when disputes arose in the village, elders sometimes brought the quarreling parties to sit beneath the tree, believing that its presence could force truth to rise. Many believed the tree punished liars. Some who swore false oaths beneath it were said to grow ill soon after, their skin breaking out in boils or their tongues swelling in their mouths. Whether truth or coincidence, these stories made the fig tree a silent judge over the village, feared as much as it was relied upon. Generations of whispers had layered around the tree like another kind of bark. Grandmothers told grandchildren that a girl had once been buried alive at its roots for disobeying her stepmother, and that her spirit lingered in the branches, watching over other children cast aside. Hunters claimed they saw lights dancing around the tree at midnight, flames that did not burn but pulsed like breath. Women fetching water swore they sometimes saw the roots shift, not like wood shifting in the soil but like muscles tightening beneath flesh. The stories made the tree alive in the minds of the people, not merely wood and leaf but a being with moods, hungers, and secrets. Even those who dismissed the tales could not fully ignore the unease that came with the fig tree. It was impossible to pass it without feeling the air grow heavier, the silence thicker. Birds perched in its branches during the day, but at night they avoided it, leaving the canopy eerily still. When the moonlight filtered through its leaves, it cast strange patterns on the ground, shapes that looked too much like faces or reaching arms. More than one villager admitted to quickening their steps when they walked by after dark, pretending not to hear the faint creak of wood that sounded almost like a sigh. And yet, despite all these fears, the fig tree endured as part of the village's rhythm. It was too old to cut, too sacred to destroy, too feared to ignore. It was both a boundary and a center, a reminder of everything the villagers believed about life and death, justice and vengeance, protection and punishment. For some, it was a shrine of ancestors. For others, it was the prison of restless spirits. But for all, it was a mystery that no one dared to fully unravel. It was into this space of contradiction that the girl was cast out. Her exile was not random, it was tied to the villagers' beliefs. To banish her to the fig tree was to deliver her into the hands of whatever force they imagined lived there. If she perished, they would say it was justice. If she survived, they would whisper that the tree had claimed her. The fig tree, with its tangled roots and shadowed branches, became not just her shelter but her trial. What had been feared and revered for generations now wrapped its presence around her, waiting as though her arrival had been destined from the first root that broke the soil centuries ago. The first nights beneath the fig tree were nights of trial, nights that stretched longer than any she had ever known. When the villagers cast her out and left her with nothing but the earth to lie on, the girl wrapped her arms around herself and sank to the ground beneath the gnarled roots. The soil was damp, always damp, as if the tree wept from below, and the chill of it crept into her bones. She shivered even though the night air was not yet deep into cold, because it was not only the air that touched her, it was the weight of something unseen. Every creak of a branch sounded louder in the silence, every rustle of leaves like whispers carried from the unseen world. She had been cast out in cruelty, but it was in the solitude of those nights that she felt the sharp edges of fear pressing against her. At first, she tried to keep her eyes closed, curling tightly as though shutting the world away would keep the spirits at bay. But the fig tree did not let her rest. From the roots came faint sounds as though the ground itself breathed. When she pressed her ear against the earth, unwilling but unable to help herself, she thought she heard murmurs, low voices speaking in tones she could not quite understand, like fragments of chants or the beginnings of songs that broke off before they could finish. She would sit upright, trembling, telling herself it was only her imagination. But then the leaves would stir again, though the night was still, and she knew there was something more. Sleep came in broken fragments. Each time she drifted into it, dreams rose up sharp and strange, hands reaching for her from beneath the soil, faces staring down through the branches, their eyes hollow but unblinking. She would wake with a cry caught in her throat, her breath steaming in the cold air, and stare into the dark around her. There were times she swore she saw shapes between the tree's roots, shadows that moved when she did not. The tree seemed alive not only in its leaves and trunk but in its very essence, watching her, weighing her, measuring her heart against something she could not name. The loneliness was another kind of torment. In the village she had been mocked and mistreated, but there had always been the noise of people, the clatter of daily life to remind her she was not entirely alone. Here the silence was total, broken only by the whispers of the tree. Even the crickets seemed to avoid this place, and the air was so still that her own breath sounded too loud. She thought of her family, of the cruel stepmother whose command had sent her here, and for a moment she almost longed for their harsh voices rather than the silence that pressed against her ears. But then she remembered their cold eyes, their laughter at her suffering, and she pulled her arms tighter around herself. Better the whispers of spirits than the scorn of those who should have cared for her. Yet, amid the fear there were moments she could not explain. Moments when she thought the tree was not only watching but also protecting. Once, as she lay trembling, she felt a root shift beneath her, curling slightly as though to cradle her body from the dampness of the earth. Another time, she woke in the middle of the night to find figs scattered near her side, though none had fallen when she lay down. And though the nights were cold, sometimes a strange warmth pulsed from the ground beneath her, as though the roots themselves carried a hidden fire. These signs unsettled her, but they also gave her strength. Perhaps the tree was not only a curse. Perhaps it was a companion or a guardian, or something more that she could not yet name. By the third night she stopped trying to shut the voices out. She listened, trembling but attentive, as the whispers in the branches grew clearer. They spoke in tones that rose and fell like the rhythm of breath, like the beat of a hidden drum. She could not make sense of the words, but she began to feel that they were meant for her. They were not the jeers of her stepmother or the cruel laughter of the villagers. They were voices older than cruelty, voices that had seen suffering and survived it. Their sound filled the space that loneliness had hollowed inside her, and though fear did not leave her, it changed shape. The cold, the shadows, the whispers, these were now the fabric of her nights. Nights beneath the fig tree, where fear and comfort wove together, where she began to learn that she was no longer entirely alone. At first it was only the girl who noticed. She had grown used to the strange movements of the earth beneath her, the subtle shivering of the roots, the way they seemed to breathe when she lay against them at night. She thought it might be her imagination, the trick of an exhausted mind, or the games of spirits whispering in her ears. But then the changes began to reveal themselves in the light of day, when others passed too near the fig tree. It began with something small, a root shifting just slightly, curling upward from the soil as though stretching after long sleep. A goat tethered near the tree bolted, bleeding in terror, its eyes rolling white. The villagers said the animal was sick, cursed perhaps, but deep down they knew what they had seen. Roots were not meant to move. Soon more began to notice. A woman walking past with a basket of grain stopped mid-step when the earth seemed to ripple beneath her feet. She swore she felt a root rise, brushing her ankle like a hand reaching for her. Her basket fell, grain scattering, but she fled without collecting it. The girl, watching from her place beneath the tree, saw the villagers whisper among themselves, pointing at her and the fig tree as though the two were no longer separate but one and the same. She heard the words "dark omen" passed between them, felt their eyes turn colder with fear. Before they had mocked her weakness, cast her out as nothing. Now they looked at her with suspicion as though she carried something dangerous, something they could neither understand nor control. Each day that followed brought new signs. Men carrying water jars quickened their pace when passing, their eyes fixed on the ground, unwilling to look directly at the tree. Children who once taunted her from a distance now stayed away entirely, clutching their mother's hands as they skirted the edges of the clearing. Some claimed they had seen roots twitch like the tails of snakes, others that they had heard a low groan from beneath the soil, as though the earth itself was speaking through the tree. At night, when the moonlight spilled across the clearing, the girl saw the shadows of the roots stretching farther than they should, reaching toward the path, curling slowly as though waiting for something, or someone. The whispers in the village grew louder. Some said she had angered the ancestors, that the spirits of the tree had awoken to punish them for allowing such cruelty. Others claimed she was a witch, that her exile beneath the fig tree had bound her to powers dark and dangerous. The elders tried to calm the people, but even they avoided the tree now, muttering prayers under their breath when they passed by. The fig tree, once only feared in stories, was now alive in their fears, its roots stirring like the limbs of something waking from long slumber. The girl herself felt both terror and wonder. She could no longer deny what she saw or felt. The roots did not simply shift randomly, they moved with intent. She had watched them creep toward a man who had once spat at her as he passed, curling around his feet before he yanked himself free in horror. She had seen them twitch in agitation when her stepmother approached, almost as though they could sense the cruelty that clung to her. But when the girl herself sat with her back pressed against the trunk, the roots stilled, quiet as sleeping animals. She began to understand that their movement was not blind. The tree was watching, responding, acting according to some hidden law older than the village itself. Fear wrapped itself around the people's hearts. They avoided the fig tree during the day, but at night, when the moon was high, they whispered about her. Some wanted the girl driven farther away into the wilderness, where neither she nor the roots could haunt them. Others argued that moving her would anger the spirits even more, that disturbing her bond with the tree could bring ruin upon them all. The village was caught between fear and inaction, paralyzed by the sight of the roots that twitched like living creatures, reaching out for anyone bold or foolish enough to draw too close. And the girl, watching all of this, began to feel something stir within her too. The same stillness that had once terrified her now hummed in her bones. She realized the whispers in the branches had not been for nothing. The roots were not merely alive, they were listening, waiting, and choosing. Each time a villager fled in fear, she felt a strange sense of power take shape in her chest. Not the power of cruelty like her stepmother had wielded, but the power of being chosen, of being bound to something larger than herself. Where once she had been only the banished girl, now she was something more, something the whole village feared, though they did not yet understand why. It began on an afternoon heavy with heat, the kind of day when the air pressed down on the skin and even the birds refused to sing. The girl sat quietly beneath the old fig tree, her thin frame hidden in the shadow of its vast trunk, her eyes lowered to the dust. 4 days she had endured the whispers of the villagers who avoided the path, their fear growing like weeds. Yet there were always those who masked their unease with cruelty, who tried to laugh away the dread that clung to the clearing. That day one such man came striding down the road, a young villager with a proud face and a tongue quick with insults. He had mocked her before, called her cursed, called her food for spirits, but this time, something sharper burned in his eyes. He wanted to prove to the others that there was nothing to fear, that she and the tree were nothing but shadows and superstition. He saw her sitting beneath the branches and barked out a laugh, loud and harsh. "Look at the witch child," he jeered, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Too weak to live in a house, so the spirits cradle her. Perhaps she will sprout roots of her own." A few villagers lingering at the edges heard him, but instead of silencing him, they watched, torn between curiosity and fear. His words emboldened him further. He stooped, picked up a stone and hurled it at her. It struck the ground inches from her leg, scattering dust across her skin. She flinched but did not move away. He laughed again, picked up another stone and this time aimed for her face. It grazed her cheek, leaving a faint red mark. Still she did not rise. Her silence infuriated him. He wanted her to cry, to beg, to show weakness for all to see. So he threw again and again, each stone heavier than the last, his voice rising with cruel triumph. But as the third stone left his hand, the ground shifted. A low groan, almost too deep for human ears, rumbled beneath the tree. The roots stirred, twitching like the coils of a snake disturbed from its rest. The villagers at the edge gasped, some stumbling backward, clutching at one another. The man froze mid-laugh, a flicker of doubt passing across his face. Then, before he could retreat, the earth split just slightly, and from beneath it rose a root, thick and gnarled, curling like a great arm. It slid across the dust with a sound like whispering breath, swift and deliberate, wrapping itself around his ankle. He screamed, jerking his leg, but the root tightened, its grip unyielding as stone. His body slammed to the ground, dust exploding around him. He clawed at the earth, trying to pull himself free, but another root rose, coiling around his waist, pinning him to the soil. The clearing filled with cries. Women screamed, children fled, men shouted in disbelief. The villagers who had dared watch from a distance now scattered like startled birds. Yet no one rushed forward to help him, not even those who had laughed at his mockery moments before. They stood paralyzed, their fear stronger than any bond of kinship. The man thrashed, his face pale with terror, his fingers clawing at the roots that dragged him inch by inch toward the base of the fig tree. The girl sat motionless, her wide eyes reflecting both horror and a strange calm. She had not moved, had not spoken, but the roots moved as if on her behalf, answering an injustice she had not dared resist. His cries grew desperate, his voice cracking with fear. "Help me. Cut them away. Don't leave me." But no hands reached for him. The villagers had already begun to run, shouting warnings through the village. "The tree has woken. The roots are alive." The elders' houses shook with the panic of voices rising all at once. Mothers dragged their children indoors, and men barred their doors against the thing they had once dismissed as legend. Still, his cries echoed in the clearing, mingling with the groan of shifting roots and the pounding of his fists against the ground. The fig tree loomed above, its branches swaying though no wind stirred. The roots pulled him closer, pressing his body flat against the earth. Dust filled his mouth, muffling his screams. His eyes rolled wildly, finding the girl. For the first time he looked at her not with scorn but with raw terror. "Make it stop," he pleaded, his voice breaking. But the girl only stared back, her cheek still stinging where his stone had struck. She had no words, no power she thought her own, yet the tree answered her silence. The roots tightened, holding him fast until his body went limp with exhaustion, pinned like prey in the claws of a great beast. When at last the roots withdrew, sliding back into the soil, he lay gasping, too weak to stand, his pride shattered into dust. Word of what had happened spread faster than fire. By nightfall, the whole village knew. A man had mocked the banished girl, thrown stones at her, and the fig tree had risen against him. Some whispered that she had summoned the roots herself, that her exile had bound her to the spirits of the tree. Others said it was punishment from the ancestors, who could no longer bear to watch her suffering. But all agreed on one thing: the fig tree had chosen its first victim, and it had done so in defense of the girl they had cast aside. Fear took root in every heart, for if the tree could punish one man, who would be next? And if the roots moved once, who could say when they would move again? The stepmother had thought her cruelty was finished when the girl was banished to the old fig tree. To her, it was the perfect punishment, out of sight, out of mind, left to the cold ground and the whispers of spirits. She boasted in the marketplace, telling anyone who would listen how she had rid her home of a burden. Her daughters smirked, repeating their mother's words, mocking the banished girl as if she were no longer human. They laughed at the idea of her shivering under the twisted branches, of her listening to the cries of owls and the groaning of roots. In their hearts, they carried not pity but satisfaction, believing their house was freer, their food richer, their nights calmer without her presence. But the village was restless. Word of the tree had begun to spread again, as it always did when the roots stirred. The whispers of omens carried in the wind, stories of roots twitching when footsteps drew near, of shadows lengthening even without the moon. People spoke in hushed tones of the traveler who had disappeared, swallowed by the earth itself when he dared to insult the girl. Fear wrapped itself around the village, but in the stepmother's home there was no fear, only scorn. She must have tricked them with her sorcery, the stepmother said, her lips curled into a sneer. The weak always pretend to have power when they are desperate. It is only the imagination of frightened fools. Her daughters nodded eagerly, believing their mother's words. though their eyes sometimes darted uneasily toward the path that led to the fig tree. Still, as night fell, the air seemed heavier around their home. The shadows crept in thicker than usual, the silence of the village sharper. When the wind blew, it carried with it not the smell of dust or smoke but the faint, strange scent of crushed figs and damp earth. The stepmother dismissed it with a wave of her hand, but her youngest daughter shivered in her sleep, murmuring of long, dark fingers brushing the window. None of them realized that the fig tree had begun to notice them, not just the girl, but the ones who had rejoiced in her banishment. One evening, as the stepmother prepared food, the shadow of the fig tree stretched farther than it should have. Though the tree stood at the edge of the village, its shadow bent unnaturally, creeping along the ground like water spilled across the earth. It slithered past the road, past the market stalls, and finally stopped at the stepmother's doorstep. She did not see it at first, but her eldest daughter, carrying water from the pot, gasped and dropped the calabash when she noticed the dark shape creeping beneath her feet. "Mother, look!" she cried, pointing to the strange darkness, but the stepmother slapped her arm and ordered her to be quiet. "Do not speak of foolishness. The night makes tricks of shadows. Go and fetch more water." But when she stepped into the courtyard, the air felt unnaturally cool, and the ground beneath her bare feet seemed softer, almost as if it were breathing. The daughters began to whisper among themselves at night. Some said the banished girl must have spoken to the spirits of the fig tree. Others swore they heard the groan of roots dragging themselves across the earth. The youngest claimed to see tendrils creeping along the walls when the moonlight fell just right. Their mother, proud and unyielding, scolded them, telling them that fear was weakness, that the girl had no power and neither did the tree. Yet in her heart, she too began to dream restless dreams. In her sleep, she saw roots curling like snakes, wrapping around her ankles, tightening until she could not breathe. She would wake sweating, clutching her chest, but she refused to speak of it aloud. One night, as they sat eating, the oil lamp flickered without wind. The daughters looked up, startled, and saw the shadows of branches stretching across the walls, even though no fig tree stood nearby. The stepmother's spoon clattered to the ground, but she quickly masked her fear with anger. "Enough," she snapped. "This house is not haunted. That girl is nothing but a curse on my tongue. We will not tremble because of her." But outside, unseen by them, the roots of the fig tree had already begun to stir again, inching closer through the soil, answering not the stepmother's words but her cruelty. The villagers, watching from a distance, whispered of what they saw. Some swore they noticed the shadow of the fig tree pressing against the stepmother's home, lingering there like a warning. Others claimed they saw the roots twitching in the moonlight, dragging themselves across the earth toward the woman who had sent her husband's daughter to suffer. Fear spread, but no one dared intervene. They all knew what the fig tree did to those who mocked or harmed the innocent. And as the stepmother and her daughters laughed in their house, mocking the girl's suffering, they did not realize the tree had already chosen them as its next lesson. The fig tree, once just a towering presence at the edge of the village, became a place no one dared to linger near. By day, its branches stretched like arms against the sky, and by night, its shadow spread like a living thing across the ground. Word of the traveler who had been taken by the roots spread fast, whispered from hut to hut, until no villager passed by without crossing themselves or muttering a prayer under their breath. Children were warned to stay far away, and traders began choosing longer paths to avoid the tree's shade altogether. The girl, who slept beneath its ancient roots, became the center of the fear. People lowered their voices when speaking of her, and eyes turned sharply away if she walked into the village for water. It was as though she carried the tree's presence with her, a haunting that clung to her skin. Some called her cursed, believing that her banishment had awakened something unnatural. "No girl should sleep beneath a tree that breathes," one old man muttered, spitting into the dirt for protection. "She has invited spirits into her body. She is not the same as us anymore." Women passing her would clutch their children tighter, hurrying away with baskets balanced on their heads, as if the mere sight of her shadow might bring misfortune. The word, which began to slip from lips, heavy and accusing, not shouted but whispered, so the air itself seemed to carry suspicion wherever she went. The stepmother encouraged such talk, spreading tales of the girl's strangeness, saying she spoke to unseen voices, that her eyes shone oddly when the moonlight struck them. Fear clung to those words, and soon the village carried them as though they were truth. But others saw something different. They remembered how she had been cast out unjustly, forced to live under a tree no one dared approach. They saw her wounds, her thin frame, her endurance in the face of cruelty. To them she was not cursed but chosen. "The ancestors are with her," whispered one elder woman as she ground maize. That tree is old, older than our grandfather's grandfathers. Spirits rest in its roots and they have not harmed her. Instead they protect her. This is no witchcraft, it is a sign. Some even came quietly at night, leaving offerings at the edge of the tree's shadow, calabashes of milk, gourds of beer, handfuls of grain, hoping to appease whatever force lingered there and to gain a little protection for themselves. The split grew sharper with each passing day. To some she was a threat, to others, a living reminder of injustice turned into power. The girl herself said nothing. She fetched water in silence, ate the scraps she could find, and returned each night to the roots of the fig tree. Her silence only deepened the mystery. Was she afraid? Was she plotting revenge? Or was she merely surviving, clinging to life while something larger than her unfolded? The uncertainty gnawed at the villagers. They had seen the roots coil and twitch. They had seen shadows stretch unnaturally. They had heard groans in the night that could not be blamed on wind or animals. The fear of the unknown grew heavier than the truth they ignored, that they had banished her, that they had forced her to this place. Mothers began telling children stories by firelight, warning them not to mock the weak, lest the fig tree claim them. Hunters avoided the path near its trunk, saying the ground felt soft as though it would swallow their feet whole. Even the bravest among the men dared not chop its branches for firewood, though the tree stood lush and heavy with leaves. When its fruit ripened, no one dared touch it. The figs fell to the ground, splitting open with a sticky sweetness that filled the air, but people stepped around them as though they were poison. The tree had become sacred in its terror, and the girl who lived beneath it was caught in the middle of that fear. Rumors twisted with each telling. Some claimed they had seen her speaking to the tree, laying her hand against its trunk and whispering as if it whispered back. Others swore her footsteps left no sound on the earth, proof that she no longer belonged to the living. A few dared to wonder aloud if she might one day command the roots to rise against the entire village. The whispers festered, breeding paranoia. Fear was no longer confined to the tree, it had begun to live in the hearts of the people, shaping the way they looked at one another, shaping the way they spoke of her. And yet, there were those who, in quiet defiance, prayed for her. They did not speak loudly or openly, but in the privacy of their homes they lit candles, hoping the ancestors would strengthen her. To them, she was not a curse but a vessel, a bridge between their world and the old powers they had forgotten to respect. The village was divided, and the weight of that division made the air thick with tension. Every night, the wind carried the sound of creaking branches, and every morning the people woke with unease. They began avoiding the fig tree not just out of fear of its roots, but because they did not know what they might find if they lingered too long. And through it all, the girl remained beneath its shade, silent and enduring, the center of a fear that was no longer just about her, but about the village itself, its guilt, its cruelty, and the possibility that the ancestors were watching. It began slowly, as if the earth itself were restless. At first, villagers thought it was only the wind rustling through the leaves of the old fig tree. But then they saw the ground heave, like the belly of a sleeping giant shifting beneath the soil. The roots, thick and gnarled like coiled snakes, stretched further than anyone had ever noticed before. They no longer confined themselves to the shadows around the trunk. They began to creep outward, silent but purposeful, sliding across the dust paths that wound through the village, curling toward the huts where whispers of cruelty had been loudest. The first to be caught were the ones who had mocked the girl most loudly. A man who had once thrown ashes at her as she passed by felt something seize his ankle one morning. He cried out, thinking it was only a thorny vine, but when he tried to shake it off, the root tightened. He clawed at the earth, shouting for help, but the more he struggled, the deeper the roots coiled around him, dragging him toward the edge of the fig tree's shadow. Villagers gathered but dared not touch him, their faces pale with terror. They watched as the tree's roots pulled him across the dirt like prey, until he vanished beneath the dark canopy. His cries echoed once, twice, then stopped. No one moved after that. No one dared. The roots grew bolder with each passing day. A woman who had laughed at the girl's hunger, refusing her even a crust of bread, found herself trapped when a root slithered through her doorway. She screamed as it wrapped around her waist, pulling her from her home. Her children wailed as they tried to cling to her, but the root tugged harder, dragging her across the ground as though she weighed nothing at all. The villagers followed at a distance, watching in horrified silence as she, too, was swallowed by the shadows beneath the tree. Afterward, no one saw her again, though on some nights, faint cries could be heard under the earth, like whispers rising through the soil. The stepmother and her children felt the fear most keenly, for they had been the ones who demanded the girl's banishment. At first, they boasted that the tree's wrath would never reach them, that the girl was merely a witch trying to frighten the weak-hearted. But soon the roots began to stretch toward their home, inch by inch each night, until the earth around their hut was cracked and shifting. The stepmother tried to sleep, but every groan of wood in the night sounded like roots scraping across the floor. She lit fires around her doorway, hoping to keep the creeping vines at bay, but the flames only cast long, twisting shadows that seemed to mock her. The villagers, powerless to stop what was happening, gathered each day to watch from a distance. They whispered among themselves that the ancestors had chosen the girl as their vessel, that the fig tree had awakened to serve justice for all the wrongs they had ignored. "We turned our backs on her," an old man muttered, his eyes wet with shame. "Now the earth itself has risen to remind us that cruelty does not go unanswered." Some wept openly, torn between fear of the roots and guilt for the silence that had allowed such torment to thrive. When the roots finally reached into the stepmother's home, there was no hiding. They burst through the floor like spears, curling around her bedposts, coiling around her legs. She fought with wild desperation, hacking at them with a kitchen blade, but for every root she cut, two more rose in its place, stronger and thicker than before. Her children screamed, clutching one another as the roots wound around them, dragging them across the floor. The stepmother shrieked for mercy, calling on the ancestors, the gods, even the girl she had cast away. But the tree did not listen. The roots pulled her into the dirt, her body twisting as she fought against the inevitable, until the shadows swallowed her whole. Her cries were the loudest yet, echoing through the village like a curse. The villagers could no longer deny what they had witnessed. Justice had taken root in the soil itself, and it was not blind. It struck only those whose hands and tongues had been cruel. The girl, still beneath the fig tree, did not speak. She did not command the roots, nor did she celebrate their vengeance. She sat quietly, her face unreadable, while the village trembled around her. To some, that silence was proof that she was the tree's chosen one, its living guardian. To others, it was a silence more frightening than screams, for it meant she had no need to explain or defend herself. The roots spoke for her, and they spoke in the language of justice. In the days that followed, no one dared to approach the fig tree except to leave offerings. Calabashes of milk, plates of roasted meat, and even jewelry were placed at its edge, desperate attempts to appease the spirit that had awakened. Children were told never to mock or harm the weak, for fear that the roots would come for them in the night. The girl remained under the fig tree, not as a prisoner now, but as a living symbol of its power. She had been banished once, silenced and broken, but now the earth itself bent to her suffering, turning cruelty into fear, silence into justice. The roots no longer hid their hunger. They sprawled across the earth like veins of judgment, reminding everyone in the village that no act of cruelty went unseen. Each twist of their growth was a warning, that those who harmed the innocent would one day be dragged into the shadows, forced to answer to powers older and stronger than any human hand. Her story began to spread beyond the narrow paths of her village, carried on the lips of travelers, wandering merchants, and children who dared not venture too close to the fig tree without first telling its tale. They spoke in hushed tones about the girl who had once been weak, innocent, and banished to the cold earth beneath the gnarled roots of the ancient tree. They spoke of how the step-family and cruel villagers had mocked her, laughed at her, and dismissed her cries, and how, in turn, the earth itself had risen to defend her, bending roots and shadows to mete out justice. Long after she had been left beneath the fig tree, the girl became more than a memory. She became a symbol, a living lesson etched into the soil and whispered in the wind. Mothers warned their children not to scorn the weak, not to mock the helpless, for the roots beneath the old fig tree were ever watchful. Fathers told of her endurance, emphasizing that cruelty carried consequences heavier than any punishment a human could devise. Even travelers unfamiliar with the village came to respect the tree and the girl it sheltered, leaving offerings at its base, small tokens of humility, acts of contrition, or simple gifts meant to honor the power that had been awakened by injustice. The girl herself remained a quiet presence beneath the roots, neither boastful nor vengeful. She did not command the tree, she simply existed in harmony with it. Her eyes, wide and knowing, reflected the moonlight that filtered through the thick canopy, and those who glimpsed her understood, even if only for a moment, that she carried the weight of ancestral power. It was said that the tree's roots moved at her slightest thought, wrapping around those who approached with ill intent, or stirring to shield her from danger. Stories told of villagers who had tried to enter the grove with greed or cruelty in their hearts, only to find themselves immobilized, their feet entangled in the living roots, forced to face their own wrongdoing before release. As generations passed, the tale of the root girl became inseparable from the village's identity. Festivals celebrated her endurance, dances honored her quiet strength, and songs recounted the night the earth itself rose to protect the innocent. Young girls were taught that strength was not always shown through loud defiance, but through silent resilience, the kind that bends the world without breaking. Boys learned that mockery, jealousy, and cruelty were not harmless. They could awaken forces far beyond human control. The elders, once hesitant to acknowledge the girl's power, became her staunchest defenders, teaching the young the intertwined lessons of justice, courage, and respect for both the natural and spiritual world. Merchants who traveled beyond the village carried small figurines of a girl beneath a sprawling fig tree, and in marketplaces far away, whispers of her story traveled, growing in richness and detail. Some said that at midnight, one could hear the faint creaking of roots, a low murmur that carried through the wind, reminding all who listened that the world bore witness to acts of cruelty and rewarded patience, endurance, and quiet wisdom. Travelers told of glimpsing a girl whose eyes gleamed like starlight beneath the fig tree, silent but commanding, a figure that seemed ordinary yet impossible to overlook. The legacy was not only one of fear or awe, it was one of inspiration. Villagers learned to care for one another, to see the weak, and to act with humility. The story of the root girl taught them that power does not always arrive in blinding force. It can grow slowly, quietly, like roots winding through the earth, unseen until it reshapes everything in its path. Her endurance beneath the fig tree became a standard by which character was measured. Children were encouraged to speak the truth, to defend those who could not defend themselves, and to recognize that every act of cruelty, no matter how small, leaves an imprint on the world. Even the fig tree itself became a living symbol, not merely of the girl's protection, but of the balance between human action and nature's response. Its roots, twisted and sprawling, reminded the villagers that the earth does not forget, that the soil remembers every slight and every act of injustice. The branches, heavy with leaves and fruit, symbolized resilience, growth, and the enduring presence of justice. Scholars from distant lands came to study the tree, marveling at its inexplicable movements, at the way its roots seemed to respond to the moral weight of human behavior, and at the legend of the girl who had become its guardian spirit. The girl, however, remained humble. She did not claim glory, nor did she demand recognition. Her satisfaction was quiet, found in the harmony that settled over the village, in the knowledge that cruelty had been confronted, and that generations to come would carry her lessons forward. She became both protector and teacher, her presence beneath the fig tree a constant reminder that the smallest, most silent acts of endurance could awaken forces capable of transforming the world. As centuries passed, the story of the root girl endured, evolving with each telling but never losing its core. She became a figure of myth and morality, a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power that lies in patience and observation. Villagers told her story at firesides, in markets, and on the steps of communal huts, ensuring that no child would forget. Cruelty harms more than just its victim, and the earth, when awakened, remembers every injustice. Her tale, rooted in both fear and reverence, became a cornerstone of the village's identity, a living legend in which the girl beneath the fig tree remained ever watchful, silent, and unyielding. The root girl, banished and powerless once, had become timeless. Her story reminded everyone who came after that strength is not always loud, that silence can carry power, and that justice, patient and persistent, is a force that no cruelty can withstand. She slept beneath the fig tree, but her influence reached far beyond its shade, shaping hearts, minds, and spirits for generations, her roots entwined with the lives of all who dared to harm, or to love, the innocent.